The morning sun cut through the thick haze of Halfway Tree, turning the concrete into a blinding, heat-soaked stage. Long, sharp shadows stretched across the pavement, slicing through the dust that hung suspended in the stagnant air. This was not a soft sunrise. It was a harsh, unforgiving glare that exposed every crack in the sidewalk and every layer of grime on the storefronts. The city did not wake up gently. It roared. The first bus hissed to a stop, brakes screaming against the metal tracks. Exhaust fumes swirled into the light, mixing with the smell of hot asphalt and damp garbage. Pedestrians began to flood the intersection, a chaotic tide of movement that ignored everything in its path. Every surface felt coated in a fine, gritty layer of urban residue. The noise built steadily, a rhythmic thrum of engines, shouting vendors, and the relentless shuffle of thousands of feet. The struggle for space, for air, and for survival was already in full motion. The city demanded movement and offered nothing to those who could not keep pace. Away from the main flow of the intersection, Samuel pulled back into the narrow gap behind a shuttered storefront. The metal was cold against his back, a sharp contrast to the rising heat of the morning. He slid down until he hit the concrete, his knees pulled tight against his chest. The noise of the street remained, a distant, muffled roar of engines and voices. But here, the world narrowed down to the space inside his own skin. His stomach tightened, a slow, twisting contraction that felt like a fist clenching deep inside him. It was a familiar, hollow ache, one that had become the baseline of his existence. He pressed his palms into his abdomen, trying to flatten the knot, but the hunger only sharpened. His breath came in shallow, ragged hitches. He stared at the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light. Every muscle in his body felt heavy, drained of energy. Yet the hunger kept him alert, a persistent, gnawing reminder of his own fragility. The hunger remained, a dull, throbbing weight in his gut. But the rhythm of the city outside forced his attention elsewhere. Samuel shifted his weight, the metal shutter behind him groaning under the pressure. He took a slow, steadying breath, trying to ignore the sharp pangs of his empty stomach. His right hand moved toward his pocket, fingers hovering for a second before they dipped into the dark, narrow space. He felt the fabric, worn thin by constant friction, and then the cold, hard edges of the coins. $300. It was not just currency, it was the sum total of his existence. He gripped the metal discs, pressing them against his palm until the edges dug into his skin. The sensation was grounding, a sharp, metallic reality that cut through the haze of his exhaustion. He traced the rough, uneven surface of each coin, counting them one by one, feeling the weight of every cent. This was his last line of defense, the final barrier between him and the absolute void of the street. He pulled his hand out, the coins clinking softly in the quiet of the alley. He stared at them, the light catching the dull sheen of the metal, and realized that this small, heavy pile was the only thing standing between him and another day of nothingness. The decision was already forming in the back of his mind, heavy and inevitable. Samuel let the coin slip back into his pocket, the clinking sound fading into the ambient roar of the street. He pushed himself upright, his muscles protesting the sudden movement after hours of stillness. He stood for a moment, letting his blood settle, his gaze fixed on the familiar intersection just a few paces away. Every instinct screamed at him to walk to the curb, to lower his head, and to hold out his hand for the usual scraps. He took a step toward the sidewalk, then stopped. He planted his heels firmly into the concrete, forcing his body to remain still. He turned away from the begging spot and moved instead to the edge of the brick wall flanking the storefront. He leaned back, letting the rough surface support his weight. He crossed his arms, his posture shifting from defensive crouch to a rigid, watchful stance. The decision was final. He would not beg today. He watched the intersection, his mind sharpening, ready to see the city as a puzzle. The intersection was a blur of motion, a frantic river of people that Samuel had ignored for years. Now he tracked the flow with clinical precision. A man in a sharp, dark suit burst from the crowd, his pace erratic, his eyes scanning the storefronts with desperate intensity. He sprinted toward a nearby vendor, his breath coming in ragged, audible gasps. He didn't look at the ground or the people. He looked only for a bottle of water. He shouted, his voice cracking with urgency, and slammed a bill onto the stall counter before the vendor could even turn around. Samuel watched the transaction, the speed of the exchange striking him like a physical blow. The man grabbed the bottle, tore the cap off with his teeth, and downed half of it in one long, gulping motion. He didn't wait for change. He turned and bolted back into the swarm, his thirst quenched but his pace never slowing. Samuel leaned further away from the wall, his eyes narrowing. The city was not just a mass of people, it was a series of urgent, unmet needs. He just had to be the one standing in its path. A woman stopped just 3 feet from where Samuel stood. She was breathing hard, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She dropped her bag onto the hot concrete, the contents spilling slightly, and began to claw through the interior with frantic, trembling fingers. She muttered to herself, her voice a low, jagged sound of irritation. "Need it now, just need a boost," she hissed, her eyes darting around. She pulled out a wallet, found nothing, and groaned, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her frustration. She was clearly crashing, her energy spent, desperate for a quick hit of sugar to keep moving. Samuel watched her every twitch. She gave up on the bag, wiped sweat from her forehead, and hurried toward a nearby shop, her pace uneven and strained. Samuel noted the pattern. It wasn't just water. People were running on empty, their bodies demanding fuel to keep up with the relentless pace. He watched the crowd, identifying the specific, recurring demands that drove them forward. He had the coins. He had the location. He just needed the product. A schoolboy in a stiff, pressed uniform cut through the crowd, his eyes locked on a vendor stall 20 paces away. He reached the counter, his movements sharp and practiced, and shoved a handful of coins onto the wooden surface. The sound of metal hitting wood was crisp. "Peanuts!" the boy demanded, his voice thin but firm. The vendor didn't ask questions. He reached into a bin, pulled out a small, crinkled bag, and slid it across the counter in one fluid motion. The boy grabbed the bag, tore it open with his teeth, and popped a nut into his mouth before he had even turned back to the sidewalk. Samuel watched the coins remain on the counter, the vendor sweeping them into a metal tin without counting. It was a closed loop. The boy gave value, received fuel, and vanished. The simplicity of the exchange hit Samuel with the force of a revelation. Samuel looked down at his own palms, then back at the coins in the vendor's tin. He just needed to be the one holding the bag. Samuel shifted his gaze away from the single stall, scanning the entire stretch of the concrete walkway. He began to categorize the vendors by their physical output. He watched a man selling water near the bus stop. The man kept his crates stacked high, forcing customers to wait while he moved heavy plastic to reach the bottom layer. The line stalled. People groaned, checked their watches, and walked away. Samuel noted the lost revenue in every retreating back. Then he turned his attention to a woman selling sweets near the intersection. She kept her inventory in a shallow, open basket strapped to her waist. When a customer stopped, she didn't reach, didn't bend, and didn't search. She simply extended her hand. The exchange took 3 seconds. Samuel tracked the rhythm of her hands. It was about proximity. It was about eliminating the friction between the customer's desire and the product. Visibility and reach. Those were the variables. He watched the successful ones again confirming the pattern. They positioned themselves in the path of least resistance, keeping their goods within arm's length at all times. He was deconstructing the physics of a sale. The noise of the street suddenly dropped away, leaving Samuel in a pocket of absolute, ringing silence. He looked at his own hands, calloused and empty, and then at the bustling crowd. The familiar ache in his stomach was still there, but the desperation that usually accompanied it had evaporated. He realized he had been looking at the street through a cracked lens. He had been waiting for the world to notice him, to offer him a scrap of mercy, while the people around him were engaged in a constant, brutal, and beautiful dance of exchange. He didn't need to be a part of the scenery. He needed to be a part of the engine. He pushed himself up from the concrete, his muscles tight and ready. He felt the weight of the $300 in his pocket. He turned his back on the wall he had leaned against for months. He walked toward the alleyway, his stride long and purposeful. The alleyway was a narrow throat between 2 high, windowless buildings. Samuel stepped off the main thoroughfare and into the sudden, heavy shadow. The temperature dropped instantly. The air here was thick, smelling of dry dust, stale cardboard, and the faint, sharp tang of industrial cleaner. He moved deeper, his boots crunching on loose gravel and discarded packaging. He found the shop tucked behind a rusted metal gate that groaned as he pushed it aside. Inside, the space was cramped, stacked floor to ceiling with crates and towering boxes that blocked the natural light. Dust motes danced in the single, weak yellow bulb hanging from a frayed wire in the center of the room. Samuel stopped. He stood in the doorway, his chest rising and falling as he adjusted to the gloom. The silence here was different from the street. It was dense, pressurized by the sheer volume of goods waiting to be moved. He looked at the shelves, scanning the rows of plastic-wrapped snacks and stacked bottles of water. Every item was a potential unit of currency, a tool for his new endeavor. He felt the weight of the $300 in his pocket, a solid grounding pressure against his thigh. He was an intruder in this world of commerce, a boy from the pavement standing in the heart of the supply chain. He did not retreat. He took one step forward, then another, until he stood firmly on the worn wooden floorboards of the shop. From behind a mountain of stacked cardboard, a man emerged. He moved with a slow, heavy gait, his presence filling the cramped space. He stopped behind the counter, his hands resting on a ledger that was stained with years of ink and grease. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked at Samuel, his gaze starting at the boy's worn boots and traveling slowly upward. His eyes were small, dark and hard, narrowed into slits that betrayed a deep-seated suspicion. He leaned forward, his weight shifting onto his palms, and the wood of the counter creaked under the pressure. The air between them grew tight. The man's expression was one of practiced indifference, the look of someone who had seen thousands of desperate faces and had long ago decided that none of them were worth his time. He tilted his head, his jaw set in a rigid, uninviting line. Every second that passed without a word felt like a deliberate test, a wall built of pure, cold judgment. Samuel stood his ground, his feet planted firmly on the floorboards, refusing to look away or shrink back. The man's silence was a weapon. Samuel reached into his pocket. His fingers curled around the crumpled paper, the edges rough against his skin. He pulled his hand out, slowly, and laid the $300 flat on the grease-stained counter. The bills were worn, soft from constant handling, but they were real. The shopkeeper's eyes flicked down to the money. He did not move at first. He stared at the stack, his brow furrowing as he processed the sight. The man's hand, previously resting heavy and dismissive on the ledger, twitched. He leaned in closer, his nose almost brushing the counter, as if checking for a trick. The skepticism in his face began to dissolve, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. He looked from the cash up to Samuel's face, his gaze no longer scanning for a beggar but for a customer. He straightened his back, his lips parting in a thin, surprised line. The barrier of judgment had collapsed. He reached out, acknowledging the boy's intent with a slow, deliberate nod of respect. The shopkeeper swept the bills into his palm, the paper making a crisp sound against his calloused skin. He gestured toward the shelves behind him. Samuel stepped forward, his eyes scanning the rows of dusty tins and plastic-wrapped goods. He pointed. A row of peanut packets caught the light. He nodded, then pointed to a stack of water bottles and a jar of colorful sweets. The shopkeeper reached up, his movements efficient and no longer burdened by doubt. He pulled the items down, one by one, placing them on the counter with a rhythmic thud. Samuel watched the pile grow. He reached out, his fingers tracing the plastic of a water bottle, feeling the cold condensation against his skin. This was not charity. This was stock. He counted his remaining coins, sliding them across the wood to settle the balance. The shopkeeper packed the items into a brown paper bag, the material crinkling loudly in the small, dim space. He handed it over. Samuel took the bag, the weight of it pulling his arm down, solid and real. He turned away from the counter and walked toward the daylight. He was no longer empty-handed. The door swung open, and the afternoon sun hit Samuel like a physical blow. He squinted, the sudden brightness washing out the alleyway, turning the concrete into a sea of white glare. He stepped onto the sidewalk, his boots scraping against the grit. The paper bag was tucked firmly under his arm, its edges sharp against his side. He stopped for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the chaos of the street. The weight of the bag was constant, a heavy, pulling pressure that dragged his shoulder down. He shifted his grip, feeling the plastic bottles and packets settle against each other. It was a solid, undeniable mass. He looked at the passing crowd, the faces blurred and hurried, and for the first time, he did not see them as potential givers. He saw them as people who needed what he now held. The bag felt like a challenge, a physical test of his resolve. He tightened his fingers around the paper, feeling the texture of the bag give slightly under his pressure. He took a breath, the air thick with exhaust and heat, and began to walk. Every step felt different. His stride was longer, his focus fixed on the path ahead. He was carrying his future, and the weight of it was exactly what he needed to stay upright. The walk back to the intersection felt longer than usual. Samuel wove through the throng of people, his shoulder aching from the constant pressure of the bag. He kept his head down, watching the scuffed toes of his boots move across the cracked pavement. The noise of the city seemed to amplify as he neared his usual corner. He reached the spot where he had spent months sitting in the dirt. He stopped. The concrete was still warm from the sun, radiating heat upward. He looked at the space, then back at the bag in his hands. A flicker of his old instinct surfaced, the urge to drop to his knees and wait for a handout. He pushed it down. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of exhaust and hot asphalt, and planted his feet. He pulled his shoulders back, forcing his spine to straighten. His hands were trembling, a fine, rhythmic shake that traveled from his fingers to his wrists. He gripped the bag tighter, the paper crinkling under his palms. He was no longer a shadow on the edge of the sidewalk. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on the flow of the crowd, waiting for the right moment to break his silence. Samuel looked at the bottle of water in his palm. The plastic felt slick against his sweaty skin. He raised it, his arms stiff, held out like an offering. He opened his mouth, but the noise of the intersection swallowed his intent. The sound of a passing bus drowned out his breath. He pulled his hand back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was exposed, a target for every eye in the street. He looked at the crowd again. They were moving, living, needing. He took a sharp breath, filling his lungs until his chest burned. He didn't look at the ground this time. He gripped the bottle until his knuckles turned white. He shouted, "Peanuts! Cold water! Sweeties!" The sound was jagged, cracking halfway through, but it cut through the ambient roar. He felt the vibration in his own throat. He shouted again, louder this time, his voice gaining a desperate rhythmic edge. He stood there, holding the water high. The sound of his own voice had barely faded when the rhythm of the sidewalk shifted. A man in a crisp shirt, moving with the hurried pace of someone who owned the street, slowed his stride. He stopped directly in front of Samuel. He looked at the water bottle, then at the peanuts, and finally at Samuel's face. A slow, curling smirk pulled at the corner of the man's mouth. He let out a sharp, dry laugh that sounded like gravel under a boot. "Look at the beggar boy playing shopkeeper," the man sneered, his voice loud enough to draw glances from nearby commuters. He shook his head, his eyes bright with a cruel sort of amusement. "Stick to the pavement, kid. You are out of your depth." The words hit Samuel like a physical shove. He felt the blood rush to his cheeks, a hot, stinging prickle that made his vision blur for a fraction of a second. The man didn't wait for a reply. He stepped around Samuel, his shoulder brushing against the boy's arm with deliberate force. Samuel stood frozen, the weight of the bag suddenly feeling heavier than before. The laughter lingered in the air, a sharp, jagged edge that cut through his newfound confidence. The man's laughter faded into the steady hum of the intersection, but the echo remained. Samuel felt the urge to drop his head, to retreat into the familiar safety of the concrete wall behind him. His shoulders slumped and his grip on the water bottle loosened. He looked at the ground, watching the dust swirl around his feet. He could walk away. He could go back to the way things were, where no one expected anything from him. But then he felt the weight of the bag in his hand, the physical proof of his gamble. He tightened his fingers until the plastic groaned. He looked up. The man was already gone, lost in the sea of moving bodies. Samuel straightened his spine, forcing his lungs to expand. He felt his pulse thrumming in his neck, a steady, rhythmic beat. He didn't look for sympathy. He looked for the next pair of eyes. He planted his feet, shifting his weight to find a solid base. He was not a beggar. He was a merchant. He opened his mouth, his jaw set in a hard line, and prepared to project his voice. Samuel drew air into his lungs and pushed it out with everything he had. "Peanuts, cold water, sweeties." The sound cut through the exhaust fumes and the grinding gears of a passing bus. He did not wait for a reaction. He shouted again, his voice cracking slightly, then finding a steady, demanding pitch. A woman in a hurried stride slowed down. She stopped 3 feet away, her gaze flicking from the water bottle to the small bags of peanuts in his hand. She looked tired. Samuel held his breath, his fingers gripping the plastic bag so tightly his knuckles ached. She didn't sneer. She didn't laugh. She reached into her bag, her movements sharp and efficient. She pulled out a $50 bill. The edges worn and soft, she held it out. Samuel stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He took the bill, the paper rough against his palm. He pressed the bag of peanuts into her hand. The transaction was silent, finished in a heartbeat. She turned and walked away. The $50 bill felt heavy, a solid anchor in his palm. Samuel did not wait for the thrill to settle. He tucked the money into his pocket, his fingers brushing the remaining bills. He turned his head, scanning the intersection with a new, predatory focus. A man in a sweat-drenched shirt was walking toward the bus stop, his eyes darting toward the heat-shimmering pavement. Samuel moved. He intercepted the man's path, holding a cold bottle of water out at chest height. He did not beg. He presented the product as a necessity. The man stopped, his hand already moving toward his pocket before he even spoke. Samuel felt his pulse quicken, a sharp, rhythmic thud against his ribs. The man tossed a $100 bill at him, snatched the bottle, and unscrewed the cap in one fluid motion. Samuel caught the bill, his hands steady, his movements precise. He felt the rhythm of the crowd now, the way people moved when they were thirsty, the way they hesitated when they were tired. He was no longer a ghost in the concrete landscape. He shifted his weight, pivoted toward a group of students near the stall, and raised his voice again. The fear was gone, replaced by the mechanical, exhilarating precision of the trade. A group of students pushed past the bus stop, their voices loud and sharp against the traffic roar. Samuel saw the sugar craving in their eyes before they even reached him. He didn't wait for them to look. He stepped directly into their path, holding up a pack of sweets like a flag. One student stopped, his hand diving into his pocket, fingers fumbling for change. Samuel met the movement with his own, his hands moving with a practiced, rapid grace. He swapped the sweets for coins in less than 3 seconds. The student didn't even break his stride, tearing the wrapper open as he walked away. Samuel felt the rush of it, the sheer electric speed of the trade. It was a blur of hands, metal, and paper. He pivoted, his feet finding the rhythm of the concrete, and immediately locked eyes with a woman waiting for the light to change. He held up another pack, his voice cutting through the noise with absolute certainty. She didn't hesitate. She reached out, dropped coins into his palm, and took the item. The exchange was instantaneous. Samuel felt his pulse hammering, not with fear, but with the raw, exhilarating energy of the market. The world around him had narrowed down to the simple, brutal efficiency of the deal. The sun began to bleed orange across the horizon, stretching the shadows of the buildings until they swallowed the street. Samuel felt the bag in his hand grow lighter with every passing minute. He reached inside, his fingers grazing only 2 bottles of water and a single pack of sweets. The frantic pace of the afternoon was slowing, but he refused to stop. He stood at the edge of the curb, his eyes scanning the thinning crowd. A man in a hurry brushed past, and Samuel stepped forward, holding the final bottle out with a steady hand. The man grabbed it, dropped a bill, and kept running. One left. Samuel felt the weight of the bag shift. Samuel moved to intercept a woman walking toward the station. He held up the last pack of sweets, his voice firm and clear. She took it, tossed him the last of the change, and disappeared into the crowd. Samuel looked down. The bag was empty. He stood still for a moment, the silence of the now empty bag contrasting with the roar of the city. He had done it. The last item in the bag was a single, small packet of sweets. Samuel held it, the plastic cool against his skin, as the evening breeze swept through the intersection. He did not move. He stood at the center of the sidewalk, watching the commuters rush toward the bus stop, their faces blurred by the fading light. A man stopped, his eyes flicking toward the packet in Samuel's hand. He reached out, his fingers brushing the plastic, and Samuel felt the final resistance of the day. He did not hesitate. He pulled the packet back just enough to let the man grab it, then waited for the payment. The coins hit his palm with a sharp, metallic ring that cut through the street noise. The man turned and vanished into the crowd without a word. Samuel looked down at his hand. The bag was gone, replaced by the weight of the coins. He stood tall, his shoulders back, breathing in the cooling air of the city. Samuel lowered himself onto the concrete, his legs finally giving way to the day's long tension. He pulled the crumpled bills from his pocket, his fingers shaking with a mix of adrenaline and fatigue. He smoothed the first note against his knee, then the second, then the third. A coin slipped from his grip, pinging against the pavement and rolling toward the gutter. He lunged for it, his heart hammering against his ribs, and snatched it back before it vanished into the drain. He sat back, breathing hard, and began to organize the pile. He counted slowly, his thumb catching on the rough, worn edges of the paper. 100. 200. The numbers grew, climbing past the initial investment he had scraped together that morning. $700. The total was more than double what he had started with. He stared at the stack, the paper feeling heavy and significant in his palm. Samuel kept his eyes locked on the stack of bills. He rubbed his thumb over the ink, feeling the texture of the paper, testing its reality against the memory of the sharp, gnawing hunger that had defined his entire life. The hunger was still there, a faint echo in his belly, but it no longer controlled his movements. He looked at the $700 and saw more than just currency. He saw the proof of his own effort. Every bill represented a choice he had made, a risk he had taken, and a transaction he had commanded. The shock of this success was a physical weight, heavier and more grounding than the emptiness he had lived with for months. He stood up, his joints stiff from the long hours on the concrete, but his balance was steady. He tucked the money deep into his pocket. The city noise continued to roar around him, but he no longer felt like a part of the background. He turned away from the wall, his stride purposeful. The neon signs of Halfway Tree buzzed to life, painting the concrete in streaks of electric blue and harsh red. Samuel stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the light dance across the pavement. A few yards away, a boy sat in the exact patch of dust Samuel had occupied only hours ago, his hand outstretched toward the passing crowd. The sight was a mirror held up to his own recent past. Samuel looked at the boy, then down at his own pocket where the earnings rested. The hollow ache in his stomach was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He was no longer the boy waiting for a miracle. He was the man who had manufactured his own. He watched the crowd ignore the boy, their footsteps rhythmic and indifferent, and realized he had stepped out of that cycle. He was not a fixture of the street anymore. He was a merchant, a man with a plan, and the capital to execute it. He adjusted his stance, squared his shoulders, and turned his back on the corner. He would not be back here tomorrow. He had a business to grow. The evening air cooled, but the heat in his chest only grew. Samuel navigated the thickening crowd with a new, rhythmic precision. He moved not like a ghost avoiding notice, but like a man with a destination. A vendor's cart blocked the narrow passage ahead, spilling crates of fruit into his path. In the past, he would have waited, head down, until the way cleared. Now, he stepped over a loose crate, offered a sharp, polite nod to the vendor, and kept his momentum. The spark of his success was not a fleeting feeling, it was a furnace. He began to calculate. If $700 could turn into $1,400, then the next day would require more stock, more variety, and a better location. He scanned the passing faces, seeing potential customers instead of obstacles. The city lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. The chaotic noise of the market now felt like a symphony. The fire within him was steady, bright, and impossible to extinguish. The city lights blurred into a vast, golden grid. As Samuel reached the edge of the district, he stopped, his boots firm against the pavement, and felt the weight of the coins in his pocket. They were not just currency. They were the physical proof of his autonomy. A few feet away, a boy sat in the shadows, hand extended. Samuel looked at the boy, then at his own hands, now calloused and steady. The memory of his own hunger felt distant. He did not reach for his pocket to give a coin. That would be a return to the old cycle. Instead, he watched the boy. He saw the path ahead, not as a struggle for survival, but as a series of calculated steps. He adjusted his grip on his bag. The city was no longer a cage. It was a market waiting for his next move. He stepped forward, his stride long and purposeful. He would never hold out his hand for a handout again. The horizon was wide, the night was young. Samuel was not waiting for the world to give him anything. He was going to take it.